With food prices skyrocketing and lengthy supply chains becoming much less secure, Perspective looks at new food production systems which could provide at least some of the answers. Regenerative agriculture combines centuries-old farming practice with modern science to allow farmers to produce food more sustainably and enhance the island's biodiversity. We also look at the award for farmers who actively support biodiversity on their land. Finlo Costain used to work for the Manx National Farmers Union and helped deliver the Thanks for Choosing Manx campaign. So what's he doing now?
I have an organisation now called Farm Well, and we run a number of projects, one of which is the Farmgate podcast, which sees me hosting interviews, talking to experts, particularly in regenerative agriculture from around the world, from the US to New Zealand and everywhere in between.
And before we go any further, regenerative agriculture?
So regenerative agriculture is agriculture that harnesses the power of nature. It recruits nature to work on behalf of farmers so they're able to reduce inputs, reduce costs, at the same time as very often increasing productivity and, of course, increasing the amount of profit that they get. So it's a way of balancing the needs of farmers and agriculture and food production with nature, with what we need to do to adapt and mitigate in terms of global warming and to help restore biodiversity, to restore nature.
So pretty much what farmers used to do.
Yeah, to an extent it's what farmers used to do. But of course, in the old days, people often did things without having the scientific knowledge necessarily to back it up. They did it by instinct. And so it's about trying to get back to some of those instincts at the same time as applying some of the scientific process, some of the knowledge that we've gained, and using some of the tools, some of the data collection tools, for example, to be able to better monitor the outcomes that are being realised as a result of the management changes. So really, if you wanted to sort of put it simply, it's about taking some of the best of indigenous farming, but applying it to a sort of modern mainstream setting and improving the outcomes for not only production of beef or lamb or arable, potatoes, whatever else you're producing, but also in terms of nature outcomes, sequestering more carbon, adapting the land so you're better managing water, for example, so we avoid flooding and can produce more grass throughout the year, but at the same time as improving animal health and welfare and the way that farmers feel about things. I have not met a single regenerative farmer who feels that they're on a treadmill. Every regenerative farmer I've interviewed and met is excited about going to work, is excited about being on the farm, is excited about the fact that suddenly they feel in control of their system feels resilient.
And I suppose the obvious question is, why have you decided to venture into this area? An obvious one will be we all need to make money, but presumably there's more to it than that.
Well, for me, it's about trying to make sure that the world that we have and pass on to our children is still one, frankly, one that you can live in a way that's recognisable to us today. And for me, the one fundamental thing, the most important thing in terms of dealing with global warming, in terms of dealing with the restoration of nature, but also producing good, high-quality, nutritious food that human beings can eat and thrive on, is agriculture, is land use. And land use is one of those things that has been, gradually dropping down the policy agenda since the end of the Second World War. DEFRA, for example, in the UK, was one of the most important departments of state back in 1950. Now it's one of the smallest departments of state, despite the fact that it still has loads of staff. It's one of the least respected. And so what I'm trying to do is to sort of show people that land use is key. We can do everything else as a society, but if we don't get land use right, if we don't change and shorten and seasonalise food systems, then we're in a very difficult place going forwards.
And actually, what you're saying there about DEFRA, I think would equally apply to DEFRA when it comes to agriculture and food, which are both in the title, and yet a relatively small portion now of the proportion of the staff are actually working on food and agriculture. And why do you think that is? Is this symptomatic of a disconnect between the general populace and food production, or is there some other reason for that?
Well, do you know what? You tell me, Phil, because, you were the agriculture minister and you were under enormous pressure at various different times to leave the Department of Agriculture, to help your career. You were told that you needed to go to bigger departments if you wanted to become more important within the government, because agriculture, even here on the Isle of Man, we've seen, the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries increasingly lowered in terms of its importance within government because we've become complacent about food. It's cheap, it's plentiful, it's available whenever we want it. We can have an avocado at any different time of the year. And that's going to change. It's going to change in the future. So it's not so much that that human behavior needs to change and choose to change. I think that nature and economic forces will push that change, will force that change upon us. And in the same way that we're expecting to be able to have this food whenever we want it, our farming has adjusted to support that need, where we have farming has become about chemistry rather than about biology. We've been using artificial chemical inputs which have stripped away the nutrients in the soil, stripped away its ability to manage water, to cycle sunlight and to photosynthesize. And now we need to relearn some of those skills.
And of course, one of the key reasons, certainly at the moment, any farmer on the Isle of Man listening to this programme will tell you, is the cost of fertiliser. And indeed, I was speaking to one farmer recently who suggested that actually it's not even about cost anymore. It's about whether there is going to be any fertiliser to buy.
I mean, one of the things that I think is really heartening is that, if you go back to the 70s and the 80s, when people were first starting to talk about organic agriculture, it was seen as a niche thing. It was seen as something a bit hippie, whereas I think that regenerative agriculture has already moved past that. You open Farmers Weekly or the Farmers Guardian, and there will be an article about regenerative agriculture in there every week, and probably more than one. It's going to be, perhaps on the facing page there'll be an advert for some, chemical fertilizer and so on. So we've still to join these things up, but at the same time, regen is becoming mainstream, and I think that's crucial in terms of getting messages out to farmers. And one of the key messages I think that farmers need to hear, and they need to hear repeatedly in relation to what you were just talking about and the impact of the Ukraine conflict on the cost of fertilizers, etc., is that this is a way of reducing reliance on inputs. So the farmers that are winning regenerative awards have perhaps saved themselves 70, 80, 100,000 pounds in the course of the year, and they haven't reduced their production. They've actually increased their production as a result because they've changed the way that they're managing things. Now, one of the projects that we run within Farmwell is the Food and Global Security Network. And, at the heart of that is soil. It's how we manage soil. And if we're thinking about security, then, people can talk about battle strategy or they can talk about tanks and guns. But frankly, you can win a war with those things, but you can't maintain a peace if you can't produce food, if you don't have the soil there to produce the food. Because
And I suppose that in terms of soil maintenance, I mean, people will think, well, the soil is the soil, isn't it? Most people listening to this programme, perhaps a few gardeners and farmers might have a better understanding about soil, but why is soil maintenance so important?
Well, soil has been so badly degraded because farming has become a process of chemistry rather than a process of biology. And I think that's the key thing that we need to turn around. And so regenerative agriculture is about, it's not about rules, it's about principles. And sort of four of the key cycles that you might think of within regen are trying to cycle sunlight, make sure that you're getting as good a photosynthesis as you possibly can. Cycle water so that your land is absorbing water, stopping it running off and flooding further downstream at the same time as then holding and releasing water so that you're able to grow grass or whatever other crop it is that you're growing throughout the year, rather than in just, spring through autumn, that it's there the whole time, even during a drought, but also allowing complexity. So you get the nutrients cycling in the ground, you're using livestock to help with that, you're allowing a lot of rest, so you're having heavy impact from livestock perhaps, at the same time as then moving them on, much more rapidly than you would have done in a different rotation, in a different sort of crop cycle, and then allowing that land to rest. And the other thing is allowing growing complexity, so that rather than trying to reduce the number of weeds or crops or whatever, you're increasing the species, you're allowing the grass to grow taller, so that although you can't increase the amount of land you have, you can increase the vertical real estate, if you like, the vertical amount of grass, of product that's being produced. And of course, if you've got grass that's growing to 3, 4, even 5 feet, we're finding at times in places like Oxfordshire with colleagues that I work with, then that's a lot more energy that's going into your cows and sheep.
And of course, for the listener who's not that familiar with grassland management, the part of the change that's maybe happened over the past 3 or 4 generations of farming is that the grass or the grasses that are grown are specifically designed to absorb the fertilizers that are produced, and are specifically grown to respond to the herbicides that are used to kill off the weeds like thistles and docks and things like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, there's a farmer that I've spoken to called George Young, who people may well be aware of through Twitter and things like that. He tweets a lot. He's over in East Anglia. He's an arable farmer. And, when he came back, he went off, he was a farming family, went off to the city of London. He was a banker, then gave up on that, got disenchanted, came back to the farm, took over from his father, who was, standard mainstream arable farmer. And he's integrated all kinds of sort of heritage wheats within what he's doing, so that there is a diversity, a resilience that comes about from diversity. And at the same time as having that diversity, it means that more nutrients are going into the soil itself is becoming more productive, it's cycling those things that I was talking about earlier, and he's getting a more resilient crop that doesn't need to have the chemical pesticides put on it because it's managing itself. It's a healthier crop in the first place, and so he's able to get really good yields while spending less on it. And I think that's it's one of those messages that we need to keep coming back to, that this is about spending less, recruiting nature to work on your behalf, and therefore even if your production drops a little, which if you're already organic it won't, it'll increase quite substantially, but even if your production reduces a little, your profit will go up. And ultimately, farmers need to stop thinking about the volume that they're producing and start thinking about themselves as businessmen and the amount of profit that they're making. And let me give you an example of that. One of the projects we have is the Regenerative project, where we're working with FAI farms across in Oxfordshire, where we're working around the world with farmers in the US, in New Zealand, in Europe, and in the UK, with big companies like Barry Callebaut, the world's biggest chocolate producer, Unilever, Ben & Jerry's, Woolworths South Africa, and Isla, to try and define what regenerative dairy looks like, because of course dairy cows require an awful lot of energy to produce the milk that they're producing. And we have this wonderful couple in Oxfordshire, Sophie and Di Wilson, who will be in a podcast that comes out in a couple of weeks' time. And they outwinter their dairy cattle, which is almost unheard of. They did it initially because they didn't have sheds when they moved on to that land, but they carried on doing it because when they've worked on the genetics, actually those cattle are much more healthy. They're much more resilient. They don't fall ill as frequently, and so although they're producing a lot fewer litres a year for them, they're still producing into a standard organic dairy cooperative into Isla, I believe. But they reckon that they're within the top quarter of earners in Britain because their inputs are so low, both in terms of medications, in terms of fertilizers, etc., and not having buildings to build and maintain and heat, and so their profits are just really high, despite the fact that their yield is lower than many people's would be. Firstly, it's important to say production may reduce. It depends how your land is in the first place. Actually, it may well increase. And certainly the farm that we've been working with in Oxford, they're going to be increasing the number of cattle and sheep that they have on the farm because they're producing so much more grass and managing it so much more effectively. But at the same time, it's not an individual farmer or an individual farming family's job to feed the world. It's their job to feed into their supply chain, It's their job to feed their own family, which is what everybody needs to do, earning money and feeding their own family, and to feed their neighbours. Now, if we all fed our neighbours, particularly through shortened supply chains, if we fed our own communities, there would be way more than enough food to go around. Now, it's a common statistic that around a third of the food that's produced around the world, particularly in richer nations, is wasted. But actually, if you include obesity, sort of the eating of unnecessary calories, into that statistic, then it rises to something like half of the food that we produce is wasted. It's not a question of needing to produce more and more and more. It's a question of trying to be better as consumers about the way that we manage food waste and increasing our own diversity in terms of our own diets. And again, that's something that will just happen naturally as the type of crops that can be produced as we face global warming and biodiversity loss and try and adapt to these things, those sorts of things will just happen.
Of course, cows and sheep emit gases, not just the ones that they breathe in and out. Many people, certainly climate scientists, are often quoted as saying this is part of the problem in relation to greenhouse gases and climate change. So if the system that you're talking about actually results in more livestock production, that's more harmful gases being produced.
You've got to start from the land. If you're living in a bit of the countryside that is particularly brilliant for growing beans and growing spuds, then grow spuds and grow beans. Actually, you could do with creating a proper rotation. This is going back to the way we used to do things, and livestock are going to be part of that. But if you're in a place that grows grass, then it's about livestock. It's livestock turning grass into something that humans can eat, and that's really important. Now, this idea that cattle and sheep are somehow the problem, or deer for that matter, is the kind of story that's perpetuated by people like George Monbiot frequently, and it is complete nonsense. And there's a phrase that we use within regenerative agriculture circles, which is, it's about the how, not the cow. So you can farm a cow in a US feedlot where you don't see a blade of grass, you don't see a tree, where every bit of feed has to be imported, where the water is brought in, where they're reliant on hormones and all kinds of other things. Yeah, that's the problem, but it's not the cow that's the problem. It's the system that they're being reared in. You put a cow into a regenerative system, then they're eating, food that is being produced. If they're being managed through a system like adaptive multi-paddock grazing or mob grazing, where they're on a relatively small piece of land for just a few days and then moved on, and that land can rest for 4 or 5 months, and you see enormous growth there, then that heavy impact, treading in the manures and that sort of thing, will mean that land is suddenly working in a way that it hasn't done. You'll see flowers coming up where the seeds have been laying dormant for 70 years because suddenly they're able to grow and flourish in that system. Now, you mentioned climate scientists and what they say. Well, I work with a lot of climate scientists, and Professor Miles Allen is one of the most senior IPCC scientists. He has, he was one of the lead authors in the 1.5 report, and he was behind the work looking at methane and creating an updated metric called GWP star. Now, the standard metric for measuring the impact of methane and other greenhouse gases is GWP 100. And talk about climate scientists, the IPCC itself said this time last year when they brought out their most recent synthesis report that GWP 100 overstates the impact of stable methane emissions by a factor of 3 to 4, while understating the impact of new methane emissions by a factor of 4 to 5. So whichever way you look at it, it's wrong, it's incorrect. What GWP star does is accurately characterize the behavior of methane. So if we're talking about nitrous oxide or carbon dioxide, which are the other two key greenhouse gases associated with agriculture, they exist and they're active in the atmosphere for between 500 and 1,000 years. You emit either of those gases, they're going to contribute to global warming from here until eternity, so far as, human beings, next few generations are concerned. Methane breaks down in 20 years. Its active half-life is 10 years. So if you've got a herd of cattle that have existed for a generation on a farm, yes, there was a pulse of global warming from the methane when that cattle herd was first established. and it will be maintained, that temperature rise will be maintained, but there's no additional warming. So now in the UK, across the whole of the UK, British Isles, we have a similar number of sheep to what we had in 1750. There's a similar number of sheep there. There has literally been no impact on global warming from the British Isles sheep flock because that number hasn't changed. There was a bit of a pulse at the beginning, but it's then just been maintained throughout and cycled. And so we need to get away from this idea that somehow cattle and sheep are part of the problem, because when we realise that actually the methane and the way that cycles is not the big issue, it's the CO2 from the chemical inputs, from the concrete infrastructure. It's the nitrous oxide from slurry tanks and from spreading of manure on fields. Those sorts of things. That's what we have to reduce. And at the same time as reducing that, we can manage those livestock in a rotation in a way that means that we're better able to manage water. We can prevent flooding. That we can make sure there's ground cover, so we can actively reduce global temperatures by making sure that the ground is maintained at a decent temperature. At the same time as improving animal health and welfare, improving the economic outcomes for farmers, improving the community and society outcomes as well.
If anyone from the Isle of Man government happens to be listening and happens to be interested in this, how could this be introduced in the Isle of Man? What changes would we see if the whole of the Isle of Man became regenerative agriculture based?
Well, the Isle of Man's a biosphere, isn't it? Which is, should be one of the big policy drivers, quite apart from the fact that everybody should want a viable, economically sound, as well as, climate and biodiversity sound agricultural system. And I think, government can incentivize these things in terms of the way that it pays farmers. So I suspect that, having come away from the common agricultural policy, farmers will be familiar with the environmental land management scheme, which a lot of us are, having spent a lot of time working with government to try and influence what they're doing, a lot of us are quite sceptical about. But I think that Wales is starting to do some really interesting stuff where, although there won't be an acreage payment in due course, there will be something which is relatively similar to an acreage payment, a whole farm payment, which requires a change in management, requiring that farmers in due course will need to do carbon footprints on their farms using GWP style. They'll need to focus on outcomes around water, around biodiversity, start measuring these things rather than simply using that land to produce food. So if you focus on these outcomes, then farmers are better able to produce food at the same time as delivering for nature. You shift where the policy emphasis is. But really, it's about the farm businesses themselves wanting to take back control. And every farmer who ever thinks about going regenerative will be suspicious that even though it's working brilliantly over there, it's not going to work on their farm. Every single farmer that's ever gone regen has said, oh, it won't work on my farm. The reality is it will work on every farm, but you do need to understand how regenerative agriculture works. And the Farmgate podcast is a great place to go to get a basic understanding of that, where experts are talking. But frankly, there's loads of stuff on YouTube where farmers, if they're interested in this, can look at it. And for groups like Isle of Man creameries, there are 30 now. It's an ever-dwindling number of dairy farms. They could take a decision to go regenerative. And I know that they're branding around grass-fed, but it's only 70% grass-fed at the moment. It's still reliant on, these inputs and those inputs. Recruit nature, get nature to work. Reduce the inputs. You've got a really high-quality, nutritious product. I don't see any reason why the prices, which are already high, as we know on the Isle of Man in comparison with other places in the UK, would need to increase, because there'll be more profit in that already. And the changes that we'd see in the countryside would be, a more active, thriving network of wildflowers and insects and hedges, a more exciting sward, all this sort of stuff, at the same time as getting a brilliant quality product out of there. And in terms of beef farming and sheep farming, it is reasonably straightforward to go regen. It's just a case of, watching some of the tutorials and listening to some of the podcasts that are now, out there and available.
And from the Isle of Man government's perspective, this, of course, if you look at the core sort of policy objectives for the Isle of Man government, having a sustainable, robust, reliable agriculture, food production sector is right up there. And at the moment, most farmers in the Isle of Man are wholly dependent on inputs from across the water.
Look, we all know what happens when the boat can't get in for 3 or 4 days. At the moment, that's because we're getting, some slightly stormy seas. In the future, we're likely to see significantly more stormy seas. We're going to see those periods when the Ben-my-Chree can't sail extending. And I think, the government just needs to be really careful. If you're thinking about food security, then on an island, food security becomes even more important. Being able to supply the basic staples and being able to promote why you're doing that to the population that exists here. I mean, you mentioned at the very beginning the idea of the Isle of Manx campaign, and that was a campaign that we were running then to try and get people to understand not just that local food was good and it was worth paying for and it was worth eating, but the impact that had on the economy of the Isle of Man and on the nature of the Isle of Man. And I think that in the future we need to see that just as a precursor to a really big project that society as a whole needs to understand, that we need more diversity in the food that's being produced on the Isle of Man. So that's the important thing as well. It's not just a case of producing beef and sheep and and just eating that when the boat can't sail. We need a greater diversity here. At the same time, we need to shorten those supply chains, make sure that farmers are earning a profit, because if they're not earning a profit, they can't farm, frankly, at all. And make sure that when the boat can't get in, when there is a drought, like we've just been experiencing, when there is flooding, etc., when there is wildfire that takes out, half the crop of this place or that place, or there's a war in another place around the world that means that there's a huge interruption in global food supply, that we're okay on the Isle of Man because we've thought about it. And we've got a 10-year plan and a 20-year plan to make sure there's resilience in our food production systems.
That was Finlo Costain from Farmwell. Could his bold vision work for Manx farms? David Bellamy works for the Manx Wildlife Trust and is providing advice to farmers on the new Agri-Environment Scheme. So what's the scheme deliver?
Well, the most obvious ones that people always pick up on are things like putting over space to nature, so planting new trees, creating new wetlands. But really, on a small island with lots of small farms, that's a really niche area. So something I'm particularly keen to look at is existing farming practices that are already beneficial to wildlife. So, for example, leaving stubbles for farmland birds over winter. And looking to maybe tweak existing practices, like leaving your hay meadows in fields ever so slightly longer so that it benefits wildflowers and ground nesting birds. And here on the Isle of Man, we've got a really unique form of agriculture that is really beneficial to many species of wildlife. So we're also looking to reward existing habitats that are really special too.
Well, I'm imagining part of this scheme is recognising some of the great work that farmers already do.
Definitely. So here on our UNESCO biosphere, 88% of the island is countryside and 72% of the island is physically is farmed. So if we don't have farmers on board, then we're never going to achieve what we want for the island. So the Manx Wildlife Trust, we're 50 years old next year, and in that time we've acquired 26 nature reserves, but they only cover 0.2% of the Isle of Man. So if we don't bring farmers on board, who, as you say, are the custodians of the wider landscape, then we'll never look to restore and let nature flourish on the Isle of Man.
So what are the standout moments for you, the treasures that you've actually found?
Well, I thought I knew the Isle of Man really well beforehand, but after being on around about 250 farm visits now, which cover a third of the Isle of Man, 47,000 acres, I think it is, I've seen there are some real hidden gems on farmland. For example, just last week, a plant was rediscovered on a farm that was thought lost, extinct on the Isle of Man. It hadn't been seen for 20 years. And a couple of weeks prior to that, we saw a wildflower on a dairy farm in the south of the Isle of Man that hadn't been seen for 142 years on the Isle of Man. So there's a huge amount of exciting things to discover on Manx farmland.
At a time, though, when we're facing quite a significant problem in relation to the supply of food, how would you respond to people who might say, well, why are we spending money to protect or to provide habitats for wildlife when we actually need food?
So I really do feel for farmers, because we're asking them to do a lot. We're asking them to feed the nation. We're asking them to make it look beautiful and green and presentable. We're asking them to clean our rivers and on our seas and look after our wildlife and to reduce carbon emissions. So it's a huge task. But because they do control and manage and look after 72% of the island, it is a necessary ask. So that's part of my job, is to help them on that journey.
And it doesn't need to be, how do you put it, a competition between wildlife and food production, does it?
No, completely not. The two go hand in hand. Nothing on the Isle of Man is really wild, as in none of our landscapes resemble in any way the Isle of Man before humans completely changed it. So the wildlife that we have had over the last centuries is completely dependent on Manx farmland, essentially. So our really cherished wildlife like lapwings and curlew and all sorts of rare wildflowers are dependent on Manx farming. And what we just need to do is just make sure that farmers are aware of what's special out there, and that they're given the knowledge and the tools to look after it.
We heard earlier in the programme from Finlo Costain talking about regenerative agriculture. Is there much scope for that on the island, do you think?
Completely, because regenerative agriculture is all about understanding your soil and ensuring its health. And if you know your soil, farming is all about that. And that starts simply with things like having soil samples done regularly, making sure the pH and the nutrient loading is correct, and over really since World War II, that has largely been done on an artificial chemical basis. The cost of those has skyrocketed in recent times for obvious reasons. So what we're doing is exploring other ways that farmers can achieve their soil health that actually have real beneficial wildlife benefits too. So we're looking at things like herbal lays, legume-rich swards, and it really does prove that nature and farming can go hand in hand.
And for people who don't have an agricultural background, of course, if you spread nitrogen fertilizers and you use the various herbicides that are used to control weeds, a lot of the sort of things like legumes and herbs are killed off by that process, aren't they?
Yeah, I think there always will be a need for what some people might say the more intensive side of agriculture, because of course we do need to feed the nation, but where it's appropriate, we absolutely must look at these different options available, and I think moving away from agri-chemicals, obviously there's clear environmental benefits there, but I think many farmers are keen to explore that because of the cost implications too.
The farming system we've managed with so well for centuries effectively relied on what we could find on the island by way of inputs, fertilizers and things would be racked from the beach. The euphemistically titled night soil that used to come out of the toilets and things like this.
Yeah, so interestingly, in many ways, we're looking back on the former ways of farming on the Isle of Man to see what we can learn from that. So this year, lots of people have been using seaweed additives on their farms to replace artificial chemicals. Slurry, farmyard manure, these natural products that are being created on the farm are a really important area. So people are looking really cleverly at those now. So having it sampled, seeing what it's deficient in, and looking at really effective ways that it can be spread and used on farm. So there's an awful lot we can learn from our forebears. But of course, the population of the Isle of Man's risen, as has our food consumption per capita. So we do need to make sure that we can learn from the past, but make sure that we're producing the food levels that we need for today.
Your role in relation to the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group, particularly in relation to this competition, what exactly have you been engaged with there?
So because I've been around so many farms on the Isle of Man in the last year, it wouldn't have been appropriate for me to be one of the Chuff Award judges. But what I have done, because I know the Isle of Man's farmland wildlife quite well, is I've been escorting the judges round and educating them where required on the habitats and species that are really special, and some of the things that farmers have been doing to look after and enhance those areas and species.
Darren Moore is from Jackson's, who are sponsoring this year's Chuff Awards. He explains how Jackson's have got involved.
We had the opportunity recently to engage with the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group having met up at the Royal Manx Agricultural Show recently, to then further cement a relationship and a partnership to start with sponsoring the awards that will be announced, I guess, in due course, which we've been judging over the last couple of days, and then hoping to build support and further engage with the community, in particular the farming community, over the longer term, as our principles are broadly aligned in terms of our environmental, social, corporate governance and missions moving forward to make the planet, but the island in particular, a better place.
Presumably, visiting farms, as many farms as you will have done for this Chuff Award, is not something that you've done before.
No, not for many years. So again, it's been a real eye opener to really get a first-hand understanding as to the histories behind some of these fantastic farms and families that are behind them, and indeed where they are now and what they're embarking upon to sustain themselves and the island for the future. And it's just been amazing. Some inspirational people from small farms, which I've learned that got sort of 100, 200 acres. I think we're actually judging some farms with even less that I'm not personally involved in, but up to 4,000 acres. So such a broad range and totally fascinating. Incredible what's happening.
And what would you say is the thing that surprised you the most about these farm visits, and what lessons would you say you've learned from the whole thing?
I think, to be honest, aside from what I've learned about farming, it is the absolute passion and enthusiasm and drive and determination that the farming community have in different ways, given their different types of farming, to build a stronger, more sustainable future for everybody. It's just been incredible.
And in terms of what you've actually seen as a judge, the specific things, are there any particular things that you're able to tell us about that you've seen that you thought, oh God, this is a particularly worthy example, or anything that has stood out as a particularly good feature that a farmer has introduced?
Yeah, I think a number of things, but in particular, just two things. One is, the areas, zones, parts of the farms which are being identified as conservation areas, and indeed what's happening there to further enhance those areas with support, as we touched upon locally, but also from their own perspective. That's just the way they think. So there's a lot going on there, and what I've also been surprised to learn more about is just to what extent wildlife, both in terms of creatures, dare I say, but also plant life and flowers, and just how much there is to fight for and for our futures. But then secondly, from a farming perspective, some of the ways in which the teams and the families are adapting to embrace new technology and think differently about how they can drive their own productivity and commerciality, so that both things sort of work hand in glove as they build that better future.
And people often say about agriculture, particularly those who don't know that much about it, it should be run as a commercial business, and if it fails, it fails. But of course the difference is we actually need something to eat, don't we?
Yeah, for sure. And again, what I've seen, strong evidence of there is fantastic sort of strategic thinking in terms of how they can adapt and change to be more productive and find new ways to do things based on some, as I've understood it, some traditional farming principles. Because fundamentally, we all need to eat. So I guess it's just that balance. But the people that we've met certainly seem very focused and have strong plans to achieve that balance.
Any plans for the garden now that you've seen all this, the wilding process that's gone on different farmers, support for biodiversity? Any, bug boxes going in, or bat boxes, or whatever?
I think there'll be quite a few. We've got a little bit of scope. I still need to learn some more to build my own confidence, because I have a partner who's very passionate about things local and a relatively small garden. But no, I'm sure there'll be a few things that we'll be adding that will hopefully add value as well to us and everybody else and the environment around us.
And perhaps even with Jackson's.
There's lots we can do there. We're on a large piece of land ourselves, and there's some quick wins there that I've been able to learn over the last few days that I'm sure we can implement to be more efficient in many ways, and again add further value to everything that's going on around the island, you know.
And often the sorts of things that you can do to support biodiversity involve bits of land that generally don't have an awful lot of use, other than someone has to go along with the strimmer every now and again and tidy it up.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's just so much we can do, and I think that for us as well, there's a big educational piece for colleagues and friends and family associated with our business. I think we employ about 85 people. So there's an awful lot there we can do as we continue to connect and partner with the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group.
In recent years, Hilary and Paul Fletcher have been the driving force behind the Chuff Award presented to farmers who have made a big contribution to nurturing Manx biodiversity. Paul told me about the award.
Goes back many moons, long before Hilary and I were involved with FWAG, that originally the Farming Wildlife Group was set up with farmers that were really focused on supporting wildlife initiatives, but equally with members. I think there were 21 other NGOs, non-government organisations, that all had a focus on nature, the environment, and so on. And the FWAG was a meeting of minds, like-minded people, and it was determined within FWAG, and back probably 20 odd years ago, or maybe longer, that they wanted to have a farm competition to celebrate this. And one of the members of FWAG at that point worked for Elman Bank, and they kindly sponsored the competition. Young lady, Steph Quayle, I think she goes as Quayle Jackson now. She was at college at the time, and she was invited to actually cast a chuff. I think at the time DEFRA, I don't know whether you were minister at the time even, but DEFRA footed the bill to then cast bronze this replica that Steph had sculpted of a chuff, and that's where the chuff goes back to, and it's been awarded for many years. We've unfortunately, through my wife's ill health and then through COVID, we've had a few years the competition's not run, but we're very grateful for Jackson stepping in as sponsors now to come alongside the farming industry and the group, and we're very much up and running, and the industry's really received it well this year.
Hilary, then, I mean, you're the driving force behind the operation in as much as you're the one that sends out the emails.
That's me. I'm the one that hassles people for the entries and whatever. We were very lucky this year, though. We've had contacted FMA, the MMA, Manx Wildlife Trust, the Flock Masters Association, etc. And most of them have put forward nominations. We ended up with 24 nominations, of which, when we then contacted people who hadn't entered their own farm, and we ended up with 16 farms, I think, that had to be judged. So it was a bit of a logistical nightmare, because we'd already arranged the judging dates for the final judging, and there was just too many to fit into the timescale we had. So beginning of last week, Paul managed to find a second panel of judges who went out and looked at the 10 big farms, and they looked at those and they narrowed it down from 10 to 5. One of the 5 didn't really have time this week to fit in with the judging, so the last 2 days there's been four farms judged. And the reason why we had such a tight window is we were very, very fortunate to get His Excellency Sir John Lorimer and Lady Lorimer out with the judging panel, so we were quite privileged about that.
And they know a bit about farming, don't they?
Lady Lorimer, you understand, grew up on a farm in Somerset, Wiveliscombe in Somerset. So she was very passionate about farming. She understands farming.
And in terms of the actual award, then, what specifically? Well, I suppose, what's the motivation behind the award?
Well, the strapline is commercial farming but in encouraging and supporting wildlife. So when the judging criteria we have this year is actually based on the UK Silver Lapwing Award. So it looks at commercial sustainability, things like waste management, use of resources. So it's not just about the wildlife, it actually covers a huge range of things. You know, we've got sort of how people manage their soil, their water, if they have any energy capture, ways of community engagement, you know, whether people use Facebook or any other, or farm visits or anything like that. All those things are part of engaging with the community, and I think this year we've been very, very fortunate, because with the new agri-environment scheme coming online, it's really important that people see what farmers are doing. You know, it's sort of, because this public money is out there, it's important that farmers see, and that community engagement of what people are actually doing is really important.
In terms of the actual award then, when is the actual award then going to be presented?
The ceremony for the award will be on the 14th of October, and that's courtesy of Jackson's.
Excellent. And in terms of the judging, I mean, it must be difficult, because I mean, you want to get people who know something about agriculture on your judging panels, but you also want people like Darren Moore from Jackson's, who actually, you know, are lacking in much by way of knowledge about agriculture, and that's important, because part of the award is to help people who don't have much understanding about agriculture understand the sorts of things that the winners and the competitors are actually doing.
It is. I mean, that's. I mean, the range of judges we had has been incredible. You know, we've had Trish Sale from the Wildlife Trust, Liz Charter, who used to be the biodiversity officer at DEFA, and then we've had farmers. The previous winner, we had both Steve and Chris Martin out. They were previous winners. So they've looked at it from the nature side and from the farm side. But of course, Darren, I think it's been a bit of an eye-opener to Darren to find out what actually goes on behind the hedge, so to speak.
And final word then from you, Paul, the success of this year's competition for you?
It's been absolutely great. I mean, one of the things is that the competition is celebrating the good practice that's been going on for generations, Phil. It's nothing new, and all we're doing is it's actually Manx farmers, same as many Manx folk, are slow at coming forwards. They don't like to shout about what they do. Then they're not boastful, but what they do, it's the way they farm, the way they care for the land, for the hedgerows, for the habitat, and so there's so much out there. And I mean, the judging over the weekend, Friday, Saturday, we actually, Liz Charter was with us. She actually re-identified some plants, some little tiny, I think a variety of strain of buttercup associated with wetland, and she actually these were thought to be extinct. They're on the danger list for plant species. They're thought to be extinct, and she actually identified at least half a dozen plants of this thing. So, you know, it just shows, it's just one example, it just shows what is actually out there on our farms that farmers are caring for and cherishing, and their presence within the farming system that we have. The island is absolutely, I think Andy Cooper used to be at the Union, worked out that we've got the greatest number of kilometres of hedgerow per square mile of land area anywhere in the world, and that provides an absolute fantastic haven for birds, for mammals, for smaller invertebrates, and so on. And there's so much more that will be shared when we come to the awards ceremony about other things that have been rediscovered. So watch this space.
It really does give you great cause for optimism hearing about the wonderful work our farmers are doing to support Manx biodiversity, and, excuse the pun, plenty of food for thought from Finlow Costain regarding regenerative agriculture. Of course, there's always another side to any discussion, and certainly redesigning the whole way in which we buy and consume food is a big ask. But relying on chemicals and food produced thousands of miles from our shores does seem to be taking a big risk with our essential food supplies. Please get in touch with Phil Gorn at manxradio.com and let me know your thoughts and views on the programme. And don't forget, the podcast is available from Manx Radio's website. But for now, I'm Phil Gorn, Guramayo Sun Geisha from. Thanks for listening.